Welcome everyone to Ecopsychology Voices, the Canadian Ecopsychology Network's ongoing series of video interviews with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. I'm Linda Buzzell, co-creator of this series with our CEN founder, Carol Koziol. Today I'll be in conversation with Dr. Craig Chalquist about his new book, Terrapsychological Inquiry, Restoring Our Relationships with Nature, Place, and Planet, that's coming out from Routledge in April. So I'm going to start with a very brief bio, and then we'll get going. Dr. Craig Chalquist is core faculty in East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, California, and former Associate Provost of Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. He teaches at the intersection of psyche, story, nature, re-enchantment, and imagination through courses on depth psychology, applied folklore, ecotherapy, and his own field of terrapsychology, the study of how the things of the world get into our hearts and live there. Founder of the world's first ecotherapy certificate program, Dr. Chalquist is on the board of Holos Institute and on the editorial board of the journal Ecopsychology, which is peer-reviewed. His books include Ecotherapy, Healing with Nature in Mind, which we edited together in 2009, and the forthcoming Terrapsychological Inquiry. If you'd like to know more, I just want to say right up front, head to terrapsych.com. That's TERRAPSYCH.com. So welcome, Craig. We've got a lot of questions here. Let's just start with, what is terrapsychology and how does it relate to ecopsychology?
Yeah, great. I'll give a brief, I kind of liked your definition that you read as part of the bio, but I'll add on to that a little bit and then give an example. Terrapsychology started for me with my dissertation work, which was a while ago. And, I was frustrated that the psychology that I had been brought up in and trained in pretty much ignored the world. Mm-hmm. And so terrapsychology, first of all, is a way of looking at how the things of the world, which can be anything from personal objects and possessions to the home that you live in, rivers, forests, streams, even the built environment, cities, how all of that is inside us all the time. It's part of our psyche, it's part of our consciousness. So terrapsychology makes a different assumption from those natural science models that say we live in a universe of separate entities and we need to prove that they're all connected. We begin from the very start by saying they are connected, and now we need to see how we look at things differently by realizing that.
Okay. And how does this paradigm shift that you just started to talk about, from we're all separate parts to we're all already connected, lead us to the idea of terrapsychological inquiry?
So we needed a methodology, a research methodology that allows us to deepen into these connections that we already live, that are part of our lives. And so in school, usually when you're studying something qualitatively on that side of the house, the qualitative as opposed to the quantitative, there are certain qualitative procedures that everybody gets taught when they're in grad school, for instance. And so you look at case study and phenomenology and a bunch of others. And the thing about all of those is they're all built to understand human experience. Mm-hmm. They don't really have anything to say about our experience with the things of the world that are already inside us. So they're not quite right for understanding that intimate relationship. There's a few exceptions to that. Like there's something called organic inquiry that actually does take, for instance, the natural world seriously, but it's not usually put in the foreground. So I wanted something for my students who actually studied ecopsychology and said, do we have an ecopsychology research method that we can use? Yeah. One that studies the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are on this planet and what we're doing here, and how it is that we so deeply feel when something is in a state of rupture, whether it's right over here in my neighborhood or the planet itself. So that's where the methodology came from.
I'm really interested in this whole idea of how we've deprivileged subjectivity and feeling in our whole culture, that somehow we've just wanted to look at things from this very far away objective point of view.
Yeah.
Are there gender issues here? I mean, what is it with
Sure.
subjectivity that's so
Absolutely.
not okay?
I remember being a graduate student hearing Carolyn Merchant talk about her book, The Death of Nature, and talk about how the qualities that are required of the researcher who only looks at things from a distance are basically the qualities that are required to be gendered as a man in a patriarchy. And I went, wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's such a huge issue. And you know, in terms also of the natural science model, if we go back to Galileo, part of where that comes from was, you know, he was pushing back against religious authority that basically told people that you know, the earth is the center of the universe, and if we wear a medieval robe, you should believe everything we say. And, you know, people like him went, this just doesn't work for me anymore, you know. So in a way, they went on the opposite side, the opposite side of the whole pendulum swing. And instead of everything being, you know, up for grabs, they went the other way and said, we're going to create a methodology that excludes subjectivity altogether because it's so full of errors and we can't trust it. And so, which was way over to the other extreme.
Even in our own field of ecopsychology, we're starting to see some of this going forward. I mean, there's been people who say, well, we don't want this sort of warm, fuzzy side of ecopsychology or the counterculture side, whatever sort of insulting words. We really want it to get back to the natural sciences and be able to prove everything.
Yeah.
What do you think of all that? Why are we even going in that direction?
Well, if we like the 1700s intellectual culture, we can go back there. I mean, you know, but everything is so interconnected now that simple studies of cause and effect just aren't going to get us very far. Mm-hmm. There's a comment that Abraham Maslow made somewhere that he said he knew many criticisms of research that matters, basically research on things that are significant, many criticisms of their lack of rigor. And he may have been talking about his own research with self-actualizing people, you know. And he said, but how come we don't hear more criticisms about research that's rigorous, but just doesn't serve any purpose? It's pointless, you know. Do we really need another study that says that, you know, a certain luminosity of sunlight makes people walk down the sidewalk faster? And who's funding this stuff, you know? So I do take the point within ecopsychology itself, that debate that you just mentioned. You know, sure, it's good to have some quantitative research. It's good to have that lens to look through, you know, but the terapsychological point is we need to do it from a whole person perspective. We need to do it in a way that tells us something about our experience instead of being caught in the fantasy of objectivity, you know.
Well, that's probably what a natural scientist might say. It's like, well, all this feeling, emotional subjectivity is great, but how do we know it's true? Mm-hmm. So if I was going to do a dissertation in your class, let's say,
yeah,
how would you address that I might get criticism from somebody outside of terapsychology that my dissertation was just made up or emotional or something?
Yeah, well, one thing I might raise is, you know, maybe what you're doing with quantitative research is true, but so what? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, does it convince anybody of anything? Are we actually winning the climate change war of persuasion?
Yeah.
You know, does your research do anything for climate scientists who are suicidal over the fact that nobody is paying any attention to them because all they have to offer are numbers and statistics that are depressing, you know? Mm-hmm. And I'd probably send them back to, I think it was maybe the 1950s or 60s or even earlier when qualitative research got going. And those were a bunch of researchers who got together and said, you know, these numbers are only taking us so far. We need to know how we experience things, and we need to develop our own version of rigorous checks on our own biases. You know, we can do that within qualitative research. It doesn't have to be all numbers, you know. And I'd probably add that the fact that you use control groups or whatever procedure you have quantitatively, it doesn't at all mean that you're not bringing biases to the study. One thing about qualitative research is it takes into account, why are we doing this study, and who is funding it, and who gets to say what the knowledge really means.
Right.
So
So how is this integral? I mean, you're teaching at the California Institute of Integral Studies.
integral studies, yeah.
So how is this integral?
So when we teach Terrapsychological Inquiry, we talk a lot about whole person research. And in the preparation phase of the inquiry, there's a lot of self-inquiry. There's a whole inventory on, why are you doing this? What do you think your motives are? And how do you know? And what do your dreams say? So we access the unconscious. During the study, there's a series of exercises we do with people as researchers to make sure they're tuned into their body states.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very careful check on people's moods as they do this work. Also, because when you're dealing with topics like, there's someone who's about to graduate now from my school, and his topic was looking at how people who suffer from homelessness as well as severe mental illness tend to congregate near damaged parts of the San Lorenzo River in Santa Cruz. And so he himself grew up with that river, and it brings things up for him too that we need to be careful to look at. So we're accessing body states, moods, the intellect in terms of good scholarship and doing your homework on a topic. So it brings in a full range of experience, and people are also doing art and movement and dance as well. So we want to get the whole person into the research. So integral in that sense.
And if I were a student in a school that isn't so enlightened, and I wanted to do this kind of a dissertation or a master's thesis, what could I say to my dissertation committee or professors that might get them to agree to something like this?
Yeah, I would speak to them in their own language and highlight the practicality of dealing with some of these more consciousness-based or experiential aspects of research. It would be necessary to make a case for it in terms that they can understand. So when I was smuggled into UCSB at one point to teach the environmental science students, and I still lecture to them now and then. And then once I actually got in, they got good reports from the students, and I was able to keep doing it. But I think the rationale that we used was something like, it makes students better scientists if they have a self-care component. I think that was how we got in. So
Good. So if I was going to start doing Terrapsychological Inquiry, maybe not part of a school situation, but just in my life,
yeah.
What kinds of things could I do?
Well, I really like some of the suggestions that we talk about in ecopsychology. And that's a part I didn't address yet, the differences. So don't let me forget about that. But,
okay.
In terms of just basic awareness of the cycles of nature, like, when you get up in the morning and go to bed at night, are you at all tuned into the rhythm of the day? Do you know anything about the place where you're living? What the flora and fauna are, and the native things that grow there, and the stories about the place from the original people, and all of those dimensions of really belonging,
Mm-hmm.
So those would all be aspects. But, to take something that's kind of maybe a little trivial, but that I think serves the example. I noticed a while back that, it's fairly common for people to lose our possessions at one point. Like you misplace your keys, or, this or that or the other thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all go through that. We all misplace things, And so I entered a period of my life where I stopped doing that, except very occasionally. And I never thought much about it. And then maybe, I think it was about 4 months ago, I bought this new little minimalist wallet because I didn't want to carry a lot of junk around. And the moment it arrived, I just put a couple of cards in it and stuck it in my pocket. And I lost it that day.
Wow.
It fell out of my pocket in the bathroom. And so when I restarted class, I was on campus. One of the students came up and said, "Is this your wallet?" And so he recovered it for me, So I went home and I went, what's the difference? And I realized that I had gotten myself into the terapsychological habit of when some new thing, some new object enters my life, I actually pause to get to know it. I appreciate it, like, you know, the textures of it, where it came from. I try to learn a little bit about that, and, you know, what's the story of this thing, and what aspect of my own psyche does it symbolize, and all of that stuff. And so I get to know it in a very concrete way. And I had not done that with this. I just bought it and stuck it in my pocket, you know. So however one chooses to think about why it works that way, the terapsychological point about this is that these things are part of us. They're part of our psyche. And so if we learn to appreciate the little things, the everyday things, the clothes that you wear, or the flowers that are growing right outside your window, or what happens, it really changes how you live in the world in significant ways. You feel much more here and embodied and like you belong here. So that's a simple thing that people can do. Just textual, you know, in terms of textures and colors and all those sensory modes, you know, appreciating the things that are around you, especially when they're new. And then extending that right outward to the neighborhood or the home you live in, or even the continent, you know, or ultimately the earth.
So you were going to talk a little bit about how terapsychology and ecopsychology connect.
Yeah. So when I explain this to students, I give the lineage of terapsychology because it's relatively new. It's, you know, only since maybe 2006 or so. I was working on it before that, but that's about when it got its name. And then now there's maybe 20 or 30 of us who are doing this work. But in terms of fields of influence, you know, obviously there's many parallels with indigenous ways of holding the world. And so we learn from that to some extent. And that goes way, way back. I mean, you know, we all have indigenous ancestors who lived in an animated, inspirited world, you know, so that's a big piece of it. But in terms of fields, we think of depth psychology, so the study of the relations between conscious and unconscious, as kind of the father of this. And then ecopsychology is the mother, maybe. And it's different from ecopsych in terms of emphasis, not so much any absolute difference. There's, you know, terapsychology comes out of ecopsych in many ways. It's like an imaginative way of playing with it, you know. But one difference is that for the most part, ecopsychology is really good at focusing on the quality of our connections, our psychological connections to the natural world. How tuned in are we, or are we? And really good at showing, you know, through not only stories, but research evidence and in other ways, that when that connection is severed, then we suffer. You know, that the world's sufferings and our sufferings are the same sufferings. So terapsychology comes along and says, we get that, that's great. And what about things? What about the built environment? What about objects? What about cars and roadways and stuff like that? So we enlarge the inquiry to include pretty much all the things of the world. So we tend to all of those because we think they're all presences in the psyche. So that's a difference. Yeah. We have our own version of animistic perception. We don't get metaphysical about it at all, but things do show up for us as presences rather than just objects. So that some of our research is on that. So.
And what about natural presences?
Yeah.
How does that, is that an important focus of terapsychology?
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mentioned that the student earlier who's studying the relationship of people to the river. There's a term that we use called ecological complexes. And we take the Jungian use of the word complex, which means a long-standing inner conflict of some kind. They used to say we were neurotic, you know. Now just we have complexes, you know. And so what we do is we look for where they are rooted in the world, the natural world itself, and how we treat it. So again, to give a concrete example, for a while I was living in this part of northern San Diego County, and I would walk every twilight just to go out and get outside and listen to the world. And I noticed that when I walked around this one area, my feelings got really flat, almost like a low-grade depression. And I didn't really think much about it at first, but it kept happening. And so one day I decided to look into it a little bit more. And if I had kept walking another 2 blocks, I would have come to this really great meadow that was once vital and living, and it was being pounded down and asphalted into the shape of a golf course, which evoked something that had happened in my neighborhood when I grew up. I grew up in a neighborhood that was an olive orchard getting turned into a suburb, you know. So that would be an example of an ecological complex where the sufferings that are happening to some aspect of nature resonate with our own sufferings too. So then we have to manage that and make that part of the research.
Right. So the first word of your subtitle is restorying. And I'm assuming that has something to do with what? Imagination, the arts? What would fit into restorying?
So one of the things that I brought to the environmental science students was the idea that when we are looking for the facts about something, when we're looking for the why, the explanation, what we're really looking for in many cases is the inside story. Mm-hmm. You know, what's really going on here? I mean, a number doesn't really mean much, especially if the number's coming to you and you aren't educated to know what it stands for, you know. But when we ask why something is, we kind of want to know what the set of relationships is and what the story is. And so we tend to think naturally in terms of story. Also, when we're giving people unpleasant facts, like, you know, those of us who do work to wake up the public to climate change, mm-hmm. if what we have to offer doesn't somehow align with or change the story internally that people have about who they are and how Earth works and all of that, the facts won't matter to them. So really, if we want to convince them of anything, we need to work on the level of story and ask ourselves, what kind of story is this person telling themselves about how all this is and what's going on? And it's really only when we get to the story that we understand how to interact with somebody like that and have a chance of convincing them to try on a different story.
And I'm guessing, since you're really good with words, that the fact that restore and restoration is right in there with it, right?
Yeah.
How does that connect with restoration of the earth?
When I first started playing around with my version of terrapsychology, because of my psychological background, I was thinking, as long as we tune in and we understand the suffering of things and all that, then we're doing a service to them. And I think we are. But I soon realized that that's not enough, especially these days, right? So one has to actually go deeper and say, how is this situation calling out to me for a response? So we heal the wound between reflection and action, the split that in our culture so often pulls them apart. So my hope for my students, and a number of them do this, is they move from the psychological part of, investigating what's happening, let's say, in a particular place, mm-hmm. and then tending the images and the stories and all the rest of it. And then they get to the part of, now what? Right. So the guy who's studying the river, he wants to actually set up a nonprofit dedicated to the health of the river, bringing in storytelling and ceremony and other methods so that people can have a sense of appreciation for what's there and know something about the history. Another researcher, Amanda Leach, when she worked with Terrapsychological Inquiry, the town that she was investigating was heavily industrialized at one point. There were weaving mills all over the place and damage that they caused. And so she actually taught a number of people in the community how to weave, and then gave them a kind of ecological education about how that relates to the patterns and threads that are binding the whole community to the earth there. So she used it educationally. So it's necessary to have some sort of a response that helps, I think.
Yeah, nice. Okay, well, I've got one last question for you. I've heard a rumor that CIIS might consider the possibility of a master's degree in ecopsychology. Is that a possibility?
It is. I was at a core faculty meeting last week, and I raised that with them. We had talked about it a little bit before then, but mm-hmm. I think the last time I taught at CIIS, so there was a gap of 3 years while I worked at Pacifica. I wasn't as convinced of the value of online learning for ecological matters as I am now. But I've had a lot of practice since then and talked to a lot of people with different ways of doing this. And I know that you can have people go out and do all kinds of things, for instance, in the natural world, and then come back and discuss it in a deep way online.
Yep.
So in order to reach them and to talk to an international community, our thought was an online master's degree in ecopsychology. So everybody that we talk to likes this idea. So it seems like it's a go. I met with the provost and she said, give me a proposal.
Mm.
So we're thinking maybe a year down the road, and we might have something. But in some ways, you know, other places that I've worked did all our marketing research, but didn't follow up with a program.
Right.
So we've got some of that done too.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.